All right, let's pick up where we left off in class this morning. Talking now about some of those countries that finally gained independence from some of the European colonial powers. In this case, we're talking about Laos, gained their freedom from France in 1954, and very quickly communists gained influence in the country. U.S. planners were fearful that communism would spread throughout the region. So if you think about the domino theory, which we talked about last year as well, fear of the domino theory. If Laos falls to communism, then other countries around them would as well. Eisenhower tried to address this issue with giving U.S. aid to the country, hoping that that would spur on democratic forces. That was not very effective. Kennedy's advisors in the next administration considered sending U.S. troops. Kennedy recognized that this probably wasn't the best solution, and we end up with, in 1962, a very shaky peace that's established. And what Laos highlights is going back to John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State from Eisenhower's administration, and his policy of massive retaliation. And it's pretty clear that the idea of massive retaliation really wouldn't be the right response in this situation, which was considered much more of a brushfire war. So, Secretary of State for President Kennedy, Robert McNamara, is looking for a more flexible response to deal with these types of situations, using a smaller military unit, special forces, or Green Beret type military. In response to the Soviets beginning nuclear testing again, the United States responds in kind and begins to test atomic bombs in space. Here's a picture from Honolulu where you can see a nuclear test taking place just above the atmosphere. Give you a sense of all of the former European colonies. My gosh, look at Africa there. If you remember the scramble for Africa we talked about last year, this indicates when these nations received their independence, and all of these are fair game for the battle for communist versus democracy. So you can imagine how widespread this was. Most of the attention in this time focuses in Southeast Asia, but certainly there are conflicts in Africa as well as in South America. So looking again at Eisenhower and Dulles' policy of massive retaliation, and again it was clear that Laos was an illustration of why this wouldn't be the most appropriate way to do it. Kennedy had the choice with Laos of deciding to give in to weak third world rebels or to massively overpower them with nuclear weapons, and neither option was a good choice. So Kennedy and McNamara devised this flexible response approach. A number of different military options, much more able to maneuver, much more elite, special kind of forces, and spending is increased to facilitate this, to make it happen. All right, stepping into Vietnam. The pitfalls or the downside of flexible response is it lowers the level at which diplomacy will be replaced by war, because if you're going to engage, it doesn't have to be a high bar that warrants massive retaliation. It's a much lower bar that's placed, and as a result, you're more likely, or one is more likely to take a military option at an earlier point in time. It does give a mechanism for progressive and endless stepping up of the use of force, so you start small and you can certainly go up from there, and Vietnam proves that it is all of the above. We mentioned before the government of South Vietnam with the very all-controlling dictator Diem leading the government, very corrupt, very right-wing, very repressive of his people. He was relying on the massive U.S. aid that was coming into the country. Certainly a lot of that was being skimmed off the top and going to his cronies, but this was what allowed him to maintain control. And there certainly were anti-government groups, anti-Diem groups that threatened all throughout this time to overthrow Diem. In 1961, Kennedy sort of crosses that magical line and he orders an increase in the number of military advisors, U.S. troops, that are sent to South Vietnam, arguably to train and advise the South Vietnamese army. The goal was initially to protect Diem from the communists long enough to allow him to enact these basic reforms that the U.S. supported and insisted upon to make things better for his people. Diem in the end refused to carry out these forms, primarily in the form of land and governmental or political reforms. So he decided he was going to do his own thing. Finally, it gets to the point where Kennedy loses his patience, and the United States supports a coup that's carried out against Diem, and Diem is killed as a result. This contributes to the long process of the disintegration of any kind of organizational structure in South Vietnam, very much contrary to what our original policy was in that country. Kennedy still tried to keep some distance and claim that this was the Vietnamese war, was not necessarily our war, but his policies made it at this point increasingly difficult for the United States to pull back. By November of 1963, 15,000 troops were stationed in Vietnam, some of these as advisors and some certainly increasing as things got more chaotic in the country. Modernization theory is basically the underpinnings of very activist U.S. policy toward the Third World. Countries, especially in Southeast Asia like Vietnam. But the idea being that third world societies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America should ideally follow the path of the West in order to develop into modern industrial societies. As a theory, as a policy direction, it was later discredited as being too Eurocentric, so coming too much from a Western European kind of basis, and ignores some of the significant differences between the West and the Third World. In Cuba, Kennedy established in 1961 the Alliance for Progress, and basically what this was a Marshall Plan. Remember the Marshall Plan as it pertained to rebuilding Europe after World War II. This was a Marshall Plan for Latin America, basically trying to rebuild or build Latin America and close that income gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. The theory is that if we are able to do this, then we would be able to keep out any kind of communist agitation, which would have been coming from generally the poor. Overall, it was not a very effective policy. The dollars in Latin America didn't have much impact, and frankly, a lot of those dollars were skimmed off the top through corruption and other societal issues. Show you the countries that received funds from the Alliance for Progress and the influence. Not significant really in any of the countries. Brings us to April 1961, the Bay of Pigs. Now there was a plan in place coming from the Eisenhower administration whereby the CIA would work with Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro in Cuba. Again, this was planned under the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy kind of inherited this when he came into the office, and he gave the okay for it. On April 17th, 1,200 Cuban exiles invaded. The plan fell apart very quickly right on the beach, and Kennedy refused, against the advice of some of those in his cabinet, to escalate. They were asking for airstrikes, and Kennedy said he wasn't going to do it. So the exiles were forced to surrender to Castro and the Cuban army. This was very much a black eye for the Kennedy administration, again, very early on in his administration, since he just came into office in the 1960 election in 61. And to his credit, he did step up and take full responsibility for the failure of this initiative. Some of the exiles captured after the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy continued to work to get rid of Fidel Castro in Cuba, authorizing assassination attempts against Castro. Castro, as a result of this and as a result of just his general direction, was moving closer and closer to the Soviets. Which brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, in October. U.S. spy planes had aerial photographs that showed the Soviet Union was installing or had installed nuclear weapons in Cuba. The Soviets were intending to protect Cuba from invasion and force the United States to back down for their demands in Berlin and elsewhere, and other trouble spots in the world. So the Soviets in this case are moving forward and putting missiles very close to mainland United States. Images of some of the Russian ships carrying missiles into Cuba. These were used to make the case, both to the administration and later to share with the public as to what was going on. One of those spy pictures from the spy planes showing land that had been moved and equipment on the ground to show what is being installed for the missile sites. More aerial reconnaissance. This diagram shows that if missiles are installed in Cuba, the range of those missiles basically exposes most, if not all, of the contiguous United States to possible missile launches. 1,300 miles to New York, 1,300 miles to Chicago, and 2,800 miles to Seattle. So you can understand the threat, or the perceived threat, should these missiles be installed in Cuba from the Cold War enemy, Soviet Union. Kennedy decided to take a very deliberate course. Instead of what some on his staff had initially argued for, that being an attack on Cuba, he opted to quarantine or blockade, a naval blockade of Cuba in October 1962. He also demanded that Khrushchev and the Soviets immediately remove any nuclear weapons from Cuba. Any attack from Cuba on the United States or any other nation in the Western Hemisphere, because Mexico would have been covered by this as well, would be regarded as an attack by the U.S. And he threatened that if this does happen at the initiation of Cuba and the Soviets, that the U.S. would retaliate with a full nuclear arsenal, with its full nuclear arsenal. Kennedy spoke to the U.S. public on October 22nd to share information that he had learned and what the status was. And seriously, it was a very tense time. It is frankly the closest this country has been to nuclear war. This is Adlai Stevenson, the ambassador to the United Nations, testifying and presenting proof that Soviet missiles were in the process of being installed in Cuba. So sharing this information with the rest of the world. And the world really was on the edge of its seat to see if the Soviets would run this blockade, if they would try to get their ships past this U.S. naval blockade. And using logic, if the U.S. sank a Soviet ship trying to run the blockade, it would be seen as an act of war. Now, it wasn't until 1991 that it was revealed that ground forces that were already in Cuba already had operational nuclear weapons on the ground, and if they had been attacked, they were authorized to use them against the United States. This was really an edge-of-your-seat, eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between Kennedy and Khrushchev was finally the one that flinched. As a result of conversation and talking, the Soviets agreed that they would pull missiles out of Cuba. In turn, the U.S. agreed to end its blockade or quarantine, and it also gave a guarantee not to invade Cuba going forward, so something of a give-in for Kennedy. Also something that the U.S. promised, and this was sort of quiet at the time, it wasn't made public knowledge, the United States also agreed that it would remove missiles that it had placed in Turkey that were aimed at the Soviet Union. So in return for the Soviets taking missiles out of Cuba, the U.S. also promises very quietly to remove missiles that we had placed in Turkey that had been aimed at the Soviets. So what's some of the fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, back in Moscow, and we've talked about this before, I've mentioned how Khrushchev seemed to be willing at times to push the envelope and to open up more to the West. Well, the hardliners looked at this situation with the Cuban Missile Crisis as something of a failure for the Soviets. They began to isolate Khrushchev and began a very extensive military expansion program. Here at home, Democrats did pretty well as a result of this in the 1962 off-year elections. So the majority for Kennedy from his party in Congress was a little more substantial. Kennedy also pushed harder as a result of this taking the world to the brink for a nuclear test ban treaty, and one was signed in late 1963, so it didn't take very long, just a year or so after this. August 1963, we also had the famous hotline installed, so a direct line between the Oval Office in the United States and Moscow. So whoever the leader was with either country could just pick up the phone and immediately be able to talk with someone. They didn't want any miscommunication between the two nations to make a mistake that might cause some significant damage. In June of 1963, Kennedy makes a speech at American University where he's trying to, going forward, lay a more peaceful groundwork for a more peaceful coexistence with the Soviets. He urged that Americans begin to look at the Soviets not as a godless and ideological and fanatical people and country, but there be something of a peaceful coexistence between the nations. This policy becomes known as détente. A quote from that speech at American University: "What kind of peace do we seek? I'm talking about a genuine peace, a kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. For in the final analysis, our most common basic link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal." Now, when Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he certainly tried to appeal to black voters. But once in office, he approached civil rights for blacks very cautiously, very deliberately. If you remember, he won election by a very thin margin and in the popular vote, and Democratic control of Congress was fairly narrow. So in order to pass legislation, he would need the support of Southern Democrats. Remember, Southern Democrats are going to be very conservative and generally, based on our history we've talked about, may not be willing to support civil rights and guarantees that would benefit blacks specifically. So in this cautious approach, Kennedy believed that any laws that they did pass would eventually benefit black Americans at least as much as specific legislation that he might create or propose that dealt with civil rights. He was not willing at this point to take a bold move, to make a bold action for racial justice. In his mind, that would have to wait. As it happened, events on the ground forced Kennedy to act, perhaps before he had been ready. By 1960, as we've talked about already, we have a wave of sit-ins spreading across the South at lunch counters. We also have a group called Freedom Riders, and Freedom Riders are groups of individuals, black and white, generally from the North, who fanned out across the South and used interstate bus transportation and became passengers protesting the segregation on those bus services. In 1961, a white mob burned one of the Freedom Rider buses, injuring many people. Robert Kennedy's personal representative was beaten unconscious as a result of this incident, and Kennedy was forced to send federal marshals into the South to protect these Freedom Riders in their protest. Also, during the 1960 presidential campaign, Kennedy had promised, as part of his campaign, to eliminate housing discrimination with the stroke of a pen, most likely by executive order. Well, after 2 years, he hadn't really done that, so there was something of a protest called Ink for Jack, where thousands of people around the country sent pens to the president urging him to take action against housing discrimination. It's a picture we saw before of the protest at the lunch counter, the sit-in. White youths at a sit-in in Greensboro as well. This is an image of the Freedom Rider bus that was attacked and burned by a white mob in Alabama in May of 1961. So in light of these events, somewhat reluctantly, Kennedy takes some cautious steps for civil rights. Going in, he and his administration were very concerned and very wary of having a relationship with Martin Luther King Jr., primarily because they were concerned about some of Dr. King's associates, that they may have some communist affiliations, and certainly this still would have been a concern at the time. They actually ordered the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, our friend, to wiretap King's phone so that they could listen into Dr. King's calls. The Kennedy administration also encouraged SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other groups to launch voter education projects and drives to register blacks to vote in the South. Remember, the percentage of blacks voting in the South at this point was minuscule. Integration in Southern universities. Some universities in the South desegregated without much pain, much effort. Some certainly did not. Some actively resisted it. In October of 1962, a black man, James Meredith, tried to register at the University of Mississippi. As a result of his efforts, the campus erupted in violence. Kennedy again was forced to send in 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to force the university to enroll Meredith as a student. Here you see white students gathering at the administration building at the University of Mississippi trying to block the enrollment of James Meredith. White students protesting the admission of Mr. Meredith to the university. More demonstration against Meredith's admittance. Note the Confederate flag and Confederate outfit. Federal troops rolling in to enforce the enrollment of Mr. Meredith. Mr. Meredith, and think about this, he had to be pretty brave in order to stand up to this resistance and to follow through with what his desire was, that being to go to college. Took a lot of heart, a lot of guts. Let's move over to Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama, the heart of the South. It was the most segregated city in the United States. Half of the population was black, but amazingly, only 15% of the voters. So think about that discrepancy, or that difference there. Half the population, but only 15% of the vote. Any attempts to desegregate had been met with brutal retaliation and resistance by whites. Things such as bombings and cross burnings, so definitely taking to violence in order to resist desegregation. In spring of 1963, Dr. King focused on Birmingham in his drive to end segregation. There were civil rights demonstrations. They were attacked with fire hoses, and we saw some video of this the other day. Electric cattle prods and police dogs were also used by the police force, by law enforcement, against peaceful protesters. Amazingly, all these images, this footage was shown across the country, and this visual evidence of the treatment of blacks in the South was shown all across the nation, and it really went a long way toward bringing the rest of the population up to speed with how blacks were being treated. Some images from that time. Some of the fire hoses were forceful enough that it would tear the skin on the backs of these protesters. Police dogs were used as well. Many of the protesters were arrested, thrown into jail. And we'll talk a little bit on Monday about Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. In June of 1963, Kennedy felt the need to respond to the nation about the events in Birmingham. He called civil rights a moral issue for the nation, and one that the nation should face. He pledged to personally, as president, find a solution, and this was the beginning of the call for specific civil rights legislation. Unfortunately, as we'll see, Kennedy was not in a position to follow through on this promise, but this did get the ball rolling in that direction. August of 1963, the end of the summer, we have 200,000 demonstrators, black and white, marching on Washington, showing significant support for Kennedy's proposed civil rights legislation. This is also the time when Martin Luther King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which I'm sure you've heard parts of before. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Thousands of these marchers around the reflecting pool at the Lincoln Memorial. From the speech itself, and I would recommend that you find that speech on YouTube or anywhere else and listen to it. It is pretty fantastic. Despite all these efforts, we continue to see violence in the South. June of 1963, a civil rights worker in the South, Medgar Evans, is shot in the back. September of 1963, we have a bomb thrown into a Baptist church in Birmingham, killing 4 black girls. All this violence leads to increasing frustration on the part of blacks and impatience that things aren't moving forward fast enough. And remember, all the nation was informed of these events and is witness to and experiencing and being aware of these events. Here's Medgar Evers. Shot in his driveway. The 16th Street Church after the bombing. These are the 4 girls that were killed in that bombing of the church. So let's take a look at what some of the strategies were for the civil rights movement, and many of these strategies were very deliberate. In the most part, certainly there were exceptions to these, but in general they decided to follow a legal path, to remain nonviolent, to stay within the law if at all possible. A peaceful resistance, though, to laws that they deemed to be unjust. It was a very close-knit community, led by church leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, and others. Passive resistance, as opposed to the violent reaction of whites. Dr. King, when he's arrested, generally he's wearing a suit and tie, so he looks very presentable, very professional, trying to go against what some of those stereotypes of blacks might be. Rosa Parks is picked as a symbol in Montgomery for the bus boycott. She's not portrayed as a single unwed mother, which she was. They asked for no special rights or special privileges. As part of this process, they were just asking for what everyone else has. In November of 1963, President Kennedy and his wife made a trip to Texas, various stops in the state of Texas. On the 22nd, he's riding in a limousine through the streets of Dallas, Texas, where he's assassinated. He dies shortly after. 2 days after Kennedy is assassinated, the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is also shot himself. In an amazing turn of events, he's shot by Jack Ruby, arguably in Jack Ruby's mind to avenge Kennedy's death. There is a federal commission appointed to look into the assassination of President Kennedy to determine its cause and who was guilty of the act. The head of the commission, the Warren Commission, is Chief Justice Earl Warren. The study that the commission publishes is tremendous. It's 26 volumes of these 2 murders, both of President Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald. And regardless of the outcome of this, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the killer and the only killer, even to this day we have many conspiracy theories out there as to what many believe might have happened and who might have been responsible. These conspiracy theories run from the Soviets being responsible for the assassination to the mafia, to Fidel Castro of Cuba, to sources within the United States government that were not happy with Kennedy and the direction he was taking the country. So nonetheless, many conspiracy theories out there, but the Warren Commission did come out with the statement that it was Lee Harvey Oswald alone who killed Kennedy. This is the limousine in Dallas, just minutes or seconds before the assassination. And I wanted to add in a mention of this. This is called the Zapruder film, and this is a film that was made by a private resident, Abraham Zapruder, on his home movie camera, and he just happened to be in the place where this happened and filmed these events. And this is probably, well, this is the most famous documentation of the assassination. And this bit of footage, these frames as part of this home movie, have been analyzed and analyzed and analyzed to determine the angle of the bullets, where the assassin might have been, everything you can imagine. But the Zapruder film, you probably will not be tested on it, but it is something that is always associated with the assassination of Kennedy because it did record the actual event. Here's Lee Harvey Oswald. So what is the importance of JFK and his presidency? Well, certainly the whole nation mourned the death of Kennedy. It was something of the end of innocence. He only served in office for around 1,000 days, and as a result of his what some would call martyrdom, he is recognized more for the spirit of what he had begun than for those concrete goals that he had accomplished, the direction that he was taking the country. Certainly later, as we go back and historians delve into Kennedy, his personality, and his personal story, his reputation has definitely been tarnished from allegations of womanizing and possible involvement with organized crime. But that doesn't really detract from sort of the idyllic atmosphere that was felt by people at the time, and certainly the great loss that they felt once Kennedy was gone. One of those women with whom President Kennedy supposedly had a relationship, Marilyn Monroe, very famously at a birthday party for the president, sings him happy birthday in very sultry tones. And that wraps up this lecture on Mr. Kennedy. We'll finish with the next section of this lecture on Monday morning.